All right, good morning, Auto One. We're here to talk about what wears out in your engine, and we're going to look at these 8 slides on parts that mostly are affected by lack of oil changes or not enough lubrication. So let's talk about it right now. So first, one of the main things that wears out in an engine is what's called engine bearings, and those bearings are what we call insert bearings. You guys are used to maybe caged roller ball bearings or tapered roller bearings, but in an engine we use almost exclusively, but not entirely exclusively, what we call insert bearings. And they're a flat bearing. They have a lot of surface contact area, or at least it seems. But what's going to happen is the crankshaft's going to basically float on a pressurized sheet of oil on these bearings. So rod bearings are the bearings that go between the connecting rod and the crankshaft. So this is a connecting rod connected to a piston, and you can see there's one shell insert there, and there's another one there. I know it's a little challenging to get the glare just right there on the computer, but we're going to put a pressurized sheet of oil in there and keep that rod from touching the crankshaft. And I've got a crankshaft right here down below. So we're talking about, this is a main journal, but here's a rod journal right here. And this one obviously, or hopefully it's obvious, lost lubrication. You can see the black discoloration from the heat of not enough, well, the heat of friction and not enough lubrication, of course. So crankshaft rod bearings and crankshaft main bearings, both will wear significantly because of oil, not enough oil life, or not enough oil, I should say. To maximize their life, I recommend changing oil every 3,000 miles. Now, I'm very well aware that most manufacturers today are recommending oil changes at 5,500 miles or 7,500 miles, or even Dodge Ram at like 10,000 miles. I'm here to tell you that what I found over the years is that if you change the oil and filter every 3,000 miles or 3 months, whichever comes first, the engine's going to last a very, very long time. And so you can talk about whether or not you want to do this from a convenience standpoint or from an economic standpoint. But as somebody who's, my sort of perspective and philosophy on cars is maintain them as best they can, pay the small bill in the short term, do your maintenance, and then the car lasts a long time. Other people have different perspectives. They don't want to spend the time or spend the cost in the short term, and they want to get rid of the car after 10 years. And that's okay if that's what you want. That's not my perspective. So the Bureau of Automotive Repair in California recommends that if you take a car into a shop, or they don't recommend, they require that the shop owner or the technician can sell a 3,000-mile oil and filter change, but only if he informs the customer that the manufacturer recommends a service interval, let's say of 5,500 or 7,500 or whatever it is. The Bureau of Automotive Repair can get a business in trouble if we sell a 3,000-mile oil and filter change and the manufacturer recommends something different and they're not informed of that. So FYI. But I have found that if you change oil every 3,000 miles, you warm up the car, it's really going to last. Let's keep going here. So secondly, other things that wear in the engine are what we call gears and chains. And what we're going to have in an engine like this one, here's a crankshaft gear connected to a camshaft gear. Sorry, it's not so focused real well. But it says with high mileage, they will wear and stretch, reducing engine performance. So what happens is, as this chain actually stretches, the camshaft will lag behind the crankshaft, and that will reduce performance. Here's a more modern engine with a chain going around a overhead camshaft and around a water pump pulley. And sorry, this is actually a timing belt. This is not a chain. And around another camshaft here, and then around the crankshaft, and then around some sort of tensioner. So as this belt wears and stretches a little bit, the camshafts will lag behind. That means the valves are opening a little bit later. We say that the valve timing, that is when the valve opens in relationship to the crankshaft, is retarded or held back. Okay, so belts, timing belts, like it says, require replacement. Some at 60,000, some at 90,000, some at 120,000. In the late 80s, early 90s, automotive manufacturers went to timing belts because they were quieter and they were lighter, and we thought this was great. And it was kind of nice, except that They do break if you leave them in there too long because of fatigue and so on, and that's not necessarily a rubber reinforced belt is not necessarily such a strong item. So enough customer complaints and automotive manufacturers in the early new millennium, 2003, 2004, 2005, have now gone back to chains. So I'll walk over to the engine over here with the camera. Hopefully I won't get you too dizzy. And we'll look at a modern mid-new millennium engine with the chains. So there we go. There's a chain there. And you can see it there. And this has got the crankshaft and a tensioner here, an oil pressure tensioner here, and driving those two camshaft pulleys. So we've gone back to chains. They don't break very often at all. It's very, very rare. And they are, let me get the camera set up here. They are quite heavy duty, and again, they last longer than timing belts, and usually they last for the life of the engine, so they don't need to be replaced. They're not as quiet, so now most automotive manufacturers have put an aluminum front cover to insulate the sound, etc. They are heavier, which is not so good for gas mileage, etc., but that's one of the price you pay for that extra strength. So let's keep going here if I can get there. We go. So next is compression rings. The compression rings are these two top rings on this piston that are used for sealing the combustion gases when they explode. So if you look at this piston right here, you can see that this one has two compression rings. That one has a damage there, but there's two compression rings, one there and one there. All gasoline pistons have two compression rings and then an oil control ring, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Diesel pistons typically have three and sometimes even four compression rings because they have a lot higher pressure to contain. And what this says is if those rings are worn excessively, and typically because people haven't changed their oil, they haven't worn up the car, gases from the combustion chamber above the piston are going to go by the rings down into the crankcase. And the crankcase is the area around the crankshaft, housed on the bottom by the oil pan and captured on the top by the engine block. And we call those blow-by vapors, or vapors that are just blowing by the rings into the crankcase. Okay, it is a source of pollution. We have a pollution control device called positive crankcase ventilation that on cars that is used to capture those vapors, reroute them back into the intake manifold and to be burned later, so we don't put some hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide into the environment. There's usually two per piston, at least on a gas piston. And sorry, went a little quick there, but two per piston, like I said. And on diesels, you've got three and sometimes four compression rings. So let's look at oil control rings, should be next. So oil control rings, like you can see this sort of squiggly line here, and then there's a rail below and a rail above. I'm pointing a little too high there, right here. So an oil control ring is going to, as the piston descends, as it goes down in the cylinder, it's going to scrape oil off the cylinder wall. So most oil control rings are a three-piece design. They have a scraper rail here, a scraper rail there, and then between they have this expander. The purpose of that expander is as the piston goes down, oil is scraped off. It actually goes through the center of the expander, and then believe it or not, there's holes. And I don't know if I can, yeah, we can kind of see them. They're right up in there. You can just see little light spots. There's actually holes up in the piston there and up in there. And again, it's a little hard to see, but oil will actually go through those holes and drop down through the center of the piston and back into the oil pan. So that's an oil controlling or oil scraper ring. And if they're worn, like it says, oil will burn in the combustion chamber. So oil gets past the rings, goes up above, and it gets burned, and we get blue smoke out the tailpipe. So blue smoke out the tailpipe means we're burning oil. Black smoke out the tailpipe, just an FYI, means we're burning too much fuel. And then white smoke or gray smoke means we're burning water. We say water, but typically means we're burning coolant and water together. So blue smoke out the tailpipe is oil. You don't see this so much anymore because engine oil quality has improved so much in the last 25 years that engines tend to last a long time. They tend not to burn as much oil. We also have the catalytic converter that's doing some work to reduce what's coming out the tailpipe, and it will take care of some of the oil. If we're burning oil and it's going into the catalytic converter, it will damage the catalytic converter um, sooner than it should be damaged. We have one oil control ring per piston. We call it one, even though it's typically a three-piece design. It's one oil control ring. Okay. So next thing is we want to talk about the cylinders when they wear. When cylinders wear, they're going to wear in a tapered pattern. You can kind of see that in this picture. So here and here, it's showing a smaller diameter here and a larger diameter here. And that's because when the piston is at top dead center, when it's all the way up there, and you get the explosion, that's when it's going to kind of rock back and forth. So it's going to tend to wear at the top of the cylinder. And it's very, very predictable and very, very common for engines to wear at the top of the cylinder. Now, when I say it's common, it was more common 25, 30 years ago when oil wasn't nearly as good as it is now. It is less common today, but if an engine's going to wear, it's going to wear up at the top. We call it a bell mouthing, but usually we just say it's tapered, meaning as it goes up, it gets a little bit wider. What you've got in the picture here is we're showing the machine shop with what's called a power hone. This honing head goes up and down as the stones spin, and we can remove metal to turn that cylinder back into a perfect circle, but slightly larger, and then we put slightly larger pistons and rings in there, and the engine is rebuilt or refurbished. Okay. Um, what we have here is the top. It says where's due to the explosion at the start of the power stroke, which I was explaining just a moment ago. So again, when the piston goes up and you get the air and fuel in there with the spark and you get an explosion, the piston tends to move back and forth, and that's where it's going to wear the engine. If it's ever going to wear the engine, that's what it's going to do. Okay, let's keep going. So next is valves and valve seats. So valves and valve seats. So here's an engine valve. And here's a picture of a valve upside down, and we can see that the 45-degree angle of that face on the valve is going to wear against that 45-degree angle of the seat. That's the contact point, and it is a circle, of course. That's the contact point. As you look at this valve seat, you can see the 45-degree angle there, that center sort of patch in there. And that 45-degree angle in there is our seat where the where the valve is going to seal compression against the cylinder head. So when a piston's going up and creating all that pressure, if it could leak, it would like to leak around the rings, or it'd like to leak past the valves, or leak past the head gasket, which is the gasket between the head and block. So we need this contact area to be concentric and very tight so that we seal compression, so we make power. If we can't seal compression, if the valve doesn't seal, it'll begin to burn the valve away. You can see this valve is burned away here. And I've got a couple of samples of valves. Here's one here. You can see the damage to that valve face there. And here's another one. This one literally looks like a mouse ate a chunk out of it, but it just burned away. Here's yet another one that looks kind of like a clover, and that's what the heat does. When the valve doesn't sit down on this seat, the valve not only does not seal compression, but the valve also does not get cooled. And so that 2,500 degrees of combustion chamber temperature isn't dissipated into the metal and then into the coolant, and the coolant passes just behind that seat and then transferred out through the cooling system to the radiator and expelled into the atmosphere. Much of the heat of combustion, most of it goes out the exhaust as hot burned inert gas, but a lot of the heat does get dissipated into the cooling system. So the valve has to sit down concentrically and seal on that seat, even if it's for a fraction of a second, not only to seal combustion, but also to get cooled. So it says here valve faces and valve seats wear and leak pressure. So if they're not sealing here, they'll leak pressure, and we'll have loss of power and misfire. And in any kind of modern car since roughly 1998, we'll get a check engine light, and we'll get one of those PO 300 codes, like 301, which is cylinder misfire number 1, 307, cylinder misfire number 7. We don't see valves burning as much these days because fuel quality has gotten better, and metallurgy of components is better, and we're controlling heat better. Engines just run better, so we don't see as much of this anymore. We saw lots of this when I was in high school in the late 70s and early 80s, and even into the 90s, but not so much anymore. Let's continue. So valve guides, it says wear and allow oil to enter the combustion chamber during the intake stroke. So same picture, but now if we look at the valve here, we call the valve stem, and this cross-hatched area is what we call the valve guide. The same thing, that guide is a tube you're looking at here in this probably a silicon bronze insert guide into this aluminum cylinder head that has 4 valves per cylinder, 2 intake, 2 exhaust. Intake's always larger. If these tubes and the stem of the valve are worn, so there's excessive clearance, then oil's going to go into the combustion chamber during the intake stroke. So when the piston's going down and the intake valve is open, I'll do it like this. When the piston's going down and the intake valve is open, then oil might come down through between the valve guide and the stem and leak. So here's a valve guide. This isn't the right one for this valve, but it does fit in here. So this is a cast iron valve guide out of a cylinder head. And if their fit is not good, several things happen. Oil comes down through and gets into the combustion chamber, and a lot of times you get a big lump of black carbon on the back of the intake valve in what's called the fillet radius right here. But you'll also, if this is worn, then that's going to cause the valve to not contact the seat properly, which won't seal combustion and will not get cooled properly, and eventually could lead to, again, to valve burning like we just talked about there. Okay, so it says oil burns during the power stroke. And so a lot of times if we get a car that when you shut it off and you restart it, it gives a puff of blue smoke out the tailpipe, it's because the valve guide and valve stems are worn and oil's getting down into the cylinder. We typically have a seal up here, and that seal could be worn as well, or could be damaged as well, I should say. Let's keep going here. So there we go. So those are things that wear out an engine. A couple of Camaros launching at the drags, and that's kind of fun. So that just gives you a brief picture of what wears inside an engine, and if you get nothing else out of this, change oil at 3,000, oil and filter at 3,000 miles or 3 months, whichever comes first, and warm up the car, minimum of 2 to 3 minutes warm up. Okay, there you go. Thanks so much.